daf here. Okay, I'm just going to, today's daf is Masechta Bava Metzia, daf, Lamed Zayin, and I'm going to go from daf Lamed Vav and Beis. I'll start from 3 lines from the top. It's a small daf throughout. And at one time, towards the end of this page, the Lamed Vav and Beis, you just need a picture to see what we're talking about over here. So I'm going to put it up on the screen. Anyway, we're talking about a chazaka. Normally, our understanding of a chazaka is you stay on a field for 3 years and you plant, you plow, and you eat the fruits of the field for 3 years. So that's simple. But there is an opinion that says that you don't really need 3 years. You just need to plow 1 day of the field, 1 day of the field during the first year, presumably the last day of the first year, then use the field throughout the second year, and then just do a plowing on the third year. So basically you need 1 day, 12 months, and then 1 day. And you have a chazaka on a field. Is that called a chazaka? So we're going to have a machlokes. Tanur Rabban, the rabbis taught near, if you just plow a field, ain't a chazaka, it's not a chazaka. Yesham and others say hareza chazaka, that is considered a chazaka. Chazaka means that you're considered now the owner. Man Yeshoimim, who is this Yeshoimim? Rav Chizda Rav Achahi. Rav Acha is the Yesh Oimim, the others that say. The Tanya, we learned in the Brisa, Nora Shana Uzra Beis. Here, you plowed 1 year and you planted for 2 years. Or Nora Beis, or you plowed for 2 years, Uzra Shana, and you planted for 1 year. So, Ein a Chazaka, that's not a Chazaka, because the Tanakama holds of this Brisa, in order to establish Chazaka, remember, Chazaka means that you don't even need to hold on to a purchase document anymore. It's automatically yours, and you don't have to prove yourself anymore. The Tanakh holds in order for that to happen, you have to be there for 3 years on the field, planting and plowing and planting and reaping the field. But if you're just plowing, you're playing around and you're plowing the field for 1 year and you didn't plant anything, that shows you're afraid that maybe you don't believe it's your field. So therefore, that's not considered a chazaka. Rav Acha says hareza chazaka is considered a chazaka, and Rav Acha will hold that even if you plow just for 1 day of the year, the last day of the first year, you didn't do anything the whole first year that you're on the field, and you just plowed at the last day of the first year, and then enjoyed the field for 12 months the second year by plowing and eating, and then planting, and then the third year you plowed for 1 day. That's considered a chazaka. So Amar Abashi Rasi says, She'elis kol Gedol Ladar. I asked all the Gedol Ladar, the Amar Li, all the great people of the generation. They said, near Areza Chazaka. It's enough to plow a field and you could establish a Chazaka. Amalei Rabbi Rav Nachman. So Rabbi said to Rav Nachman, my time of the man near Chazaka. What's the reason why you hold plowing a field is enough to make a Chazaka? No one would allow somebody to just plow his field and be quiet. And the fact that the original owner is quiet, it must be that he agreed that he sold the field to the guy that's now on his field. Now, my Tama, what's the reason? What's the reason of the person that holds plowing is not considered as chazaka? Because the guy that owns the field, he doesn't want to, if he sees somebody plowing your field, right? It's like if I would watch somebody go into my backyard and start mowing my lawn, I'm okay with that. Because, so same thing with a guy seeing somebody else plowing your field, called Shiba Vashiva, he doesn't mind every time he puts the plowshare into his field, because eventually he's going to plow the whole field, and the owner says, when he's finished, I'm going to come in and I'm going to take over the field. So that's why he didn't protest. And therefore, just plowing a field is not enough to establish chazaka. You really have to be there a long time and plow and plant and eat. The people from Pum Nahara sent a question to Rav Nachman bar Rav Chizda. Yilamdeinu Rabbeinu, teach us, Rabbi, Nira have a chazaka or le have a chazaka? Is plowing a field a chazaka or is not a chazaka? Amalahu, so Rav Nachman bar Rav Chizda said, Rav Acha b'chol Gedol Ladar Amr Nir Hara has a chazaka. You have this Rav Acha, and all the great people of the generation said, just plowing a field is enough to make a chazaka. So that's it. According to the way Rav Nachman bar Rav Chizda said, you don't even need full 3 years. You just need 1 day, 12 months, and then 1 day, and you could establish chazaka. But Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak says, Ravusa l'mechshav gavre, is it, are you name dropping big names? I'll show you that there are other Tanoim and great Amoraim who hold you really need the full 3 years. Harav, Shmuel, Bava, Rav and Shmuel and Bava, Rabbi Shmuel, Rabbi Akiva, Be'eretz Yisrael, Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva, Tanoim, who lived in Israel, they said, near loy have a chazaka. Just plowing a field is not a chazaka. You actually have to be there for 3 full years. Rabbi Shmuel, Rabbi Akiva must nisni. Rabbi Shmuel, Rabbi Akiva, you can see that in our Mishnah. They each one, they don't hold it. You need a full 3 years, but they hold that you need a minimum of either 14 months or they need 18 months, but definitely not 1 day and 12 months. They need more time. You need more time to be able to enjoy the fruits of the field. Rav Mahi, what is the opinion of Rav? What does Rav hold? What establishes a chazaka? Rav says the Chachamim say, and Rav holds like the Chachamim, in order to establish a chazaka, you need gimel shanim miyoim liyoim. You need 3 years, and that you are on working this field for 3 years, 365 days a year. What does it mean? You have to work on it every single day. If you just plow a field for 1 day a year and you're not busy with the field at all during the year, that means planting and cutting and watering and doing whatever you have to do and reaping, that's not enough to establish chazaka. So we see Rav is very strict that you really need to work the field for 3 full years in order to establish chazaka. Shmuel Mahi. What do you see? Shmuel agrees with Rav. Rav Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel, Zudiv Rabbi Shmuel Akiva, Chachamim say, according to Shmuel, the Chachamim hold Yigdar Shalish Gediris Vivtza Gival Batziris Vimtza Gimel Masikas. If it's a Sdei Elon, a fruit tree, a fruit field, so then you have to have 3 seasons. That, let's say on this fruit orchard, you're growing olives, grapes, and dates, right, or figs. So then you have to have 3 seasons of each of those fruits. You have to have 3 seasons of figs, 3 seasons of olives, and 3 seasons of grapes. That's what he says. So basically, according to Shmuel, the Chachamim hold you need basically 3 years. My benai, what would be the difference between Shmuel and Rav? Both hold that you need 3 complete years. Amar Abai said, Dekanara ika benai. If according to Shmuel, sometimes you can lessen the amount by 3 years. If you have a young date tree that produces fruit faster than 3 years, it produces 3 productions, but instead of each year of production, it does it less than 3 years. So according to Shmuel, that would still be considered a chazaka because you had 3 seasons from that fruit. But according to Rav, you actually need 3 full years miyoim liyoim. Miyoim liyoim means 365 days of 3 years in order to establish a chazaka. Rabbi Shmuel ben Medvar Mistei Lavan. Rabbi Shmuel said a statement in our Mishnah that's Rabbi Shmuel totally disagreed. He said another thing, that in a fruit tree, let's say you have a fruit tree, sometimes you can make a chazaka in less than a year. If you're growing in that fruit orchard, 3 different types of fruits, and each one produced in a season. So if you have an olive tree in this Sdei Elon, in this orchard, and you have a fig tree, and you have a fig tree, and you have grapes. So as long as you have 1 production from each of those trees, you can establish the chazaka even in 1 year. So that's the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael. Amar Abaya, Rabbi is going to say like this. I'm going to bring the picture up on the screen over here. Abaya is going to say a statement like this, and here you can see it very, very clear. If you have 30 trees growing in what normally you would grow 30 trees in by 50 by 50, each has 10 trees, right? 10 trees. According to Abaya, if I would not know anything, I would think that in order to establish a chazaka, I have to eat the fruits from each of these trees. But Rabbi is going to come with this novel idea that you don't have to eat the fruit of each of these trees. You can just eat the fruit of 10 of those trees, and it establishes a chazaka for the rest of the fruits, the rest of the trees that you did not eat from. So if you eat 3 from the first, right over here, 1, 2, 3, or 1, 2, 3 over here, and 1, 2, 3 over here, so 4 over here, or 3 over there, basically you eat the fruits of 10 of the trees, you establish the chazaka for the entire place over here. And that's a big chiddush, because you would think that you have to eat the fruits of each of those trees. That's what Abaya says. So Abaye says, Amar Abaye, Min Shmuel Nishbal Rabbanim. From Shmuel, you can understand the Rabbanim. If you have 30 trees in a space where you can plant, in each section, you can plant 10 trees. If you eat 10 from 10 of the trees this year, and 10 of the trees the next year, in other words, you don't have to eat from the 30 trees, harvest the 30 trees each year. You can eat 10 trees this year, 10 trees the next year, different 10 trees, and the third 10 trees of the third year. And collectively, you can establish a chazakah because you're on that field, on that large field, for 3 years. We go to Lamed Zayin Amar Aleph. Lav miyamar Rab Shmuel. Didn't Rab Shmuel said, Chad peira have a chazakah, lukule peira, that if you just harvest one fruit, you can establish a chazakah for the rest of the peiros. So let's say, according to Rabbi Shmuel, if you just harvest olives, you already established chazakah for grapes, even though you didn't harvest grapes. And when the harvest time for grapes comes, you're going to establish a chazakah for the figs. And that's what each one will be considered a year chazakah, although you're only harvesting one fruit. Hachinami, so same thing over here. Hani have a chazakah lahani, v'hani have a chazakah lahani. Each time you take 10 trees and you eat from those 10 trees, it establishes for that year chazakah on all 30 trees. So if each year I'm eating from 10 trees and the entire field has 30 trees, it's as if I ate from all those 30 trees each and every year, and therefore I can establish chazakah. Hani mili, this was only said eicha de loy apika, aval apika v'loy acha loy have chazakah. Big exception, a big rule that when does it say the only time if you eat from 10 trees and you didn't eat from all 30 trees is because the other 20 trees did not give off fruit that year. It's a type of fruit, let's say the Rashbam says, that only gives off fruit once every 3 years. So then the reason why you didn't eat it because it didn't give off fruit, then you could establish a chazakah because there was nothing to eat. But if it did give off fruit and you just left it on the tree, then it wouldn't be a chazakah because you only ate 10 trees. And there's fruits on the other 20. So why didn't you eat from those fruits? Why didn't you eat from them? It must be you yourself don't believe that you own the karka. You don't believe that you own this field. So therefore, you wouldn't be able to establish chazakah if you could have eaten from those 20 other trees. And v'hu debazi ba'uzuze, you ate from in each, like you can see in the picture over here, from each section, you ate a little bit of those trees from each section. But if you ate from one section 10 trees, and each year you ate from another section all 10 trees, since you didn't spread it out, you probably could assume that each of these sections becomes their own little field, and that doesn't establish chazakah for the rest of the trees in that field, even though it's considered one field. But since 10 trees are grown in a section of the field, we can actually separate out each section so that when you make chazak in one section, it will not apply to the other section. Okay, let's go to the next Gemara. The Gemara continues like this. New Gemara. Gemara says, let's say you have one guy, he's selling his property. So he sold to one guy the trees, and he sold to the other guy the land. So the guy that owns the trees, he probably did a chazakah to acquire ownership of the trees. He cut a branch. The guy that owns the karka put a fence around the field. Okay, so now one guy owns the trees and one guy owns the karka, the land. What happens if the tree dies? If the tree dies, does the guy have a right to replant another tree? Amar Rav Zid said, this guy only gets one chance with his tree. And this guy who owns the land has the rights to the land. And therefore, if the tree would die, that's it. The guy that bought the tree will not be able to replant in the location of the original tree, uproot the dead tree and plant a new tree there. Maskif la Rapapa says, in Cain, ein loy lebalanos bekarka klum. That what you're basically saying, that when a person buys a tree, he's only buying the tree and not the land underneath. So what's going to happen is, and this is exactly the way I'm explaining it, that when the tree is going to die, the owner of the land will tell the owner of the tree When it dies, when your tree dies, akar ilanach, take your tree, shkal vazil, get out. In other words, you only bought something that could only last temporarily. And so Rav Papa has a hard time to understand that. When I spent all this money to buy a tree, it's because I'm not spending that money and then 5 years later to find out the tree died because it got sick and died. I really want to buy the tree plus the land underneath the tree so that if the tree would die, I have a chance to plant another tree there. So Rav Papa disagrees with Rav Zvid, and he says that when you buy a tree, you actually bought the land underneath. Elam Rav Papa said, that when you buy a tree, you actually own part of the land that supports the tree. That's yours. And the one that bought the property, he owns everything else that's not related to that tree. So that Rav Papa would hold that if, in case the tree would die, we would give the owner, the guy that bought the tree, the right to plant another tree. Again, we're talking about one person, two people buying a property from one person. Two people buying from one person. One bought the trees and one bought the land. The question is, if the tree would die, do we give a right for the owner of the tree to replant another tree? Rav Zvid said no, and Rav Papa said yes. Now, Pshita, the Gemara says, is very simple. Mocha karka v'shayir ilanis lefanov. Let's say you have one guy, he owns a piece of land, and he sold the property, but he's holding on to the tree. So if you were the original owner of the land and you're just selling the tree, yesh le karka, that means you definitely still own the land. In other words, if the tree would die, you didn't mean to sell, everything, and that if the tree would die, you would have no right to replant. Since you were the original owner of this field with the trees, you definitely, when you sold the land, you meant to sell the land, everything besides the land underneath the tree. And this would be, even according to Rabbi Kiva, the Amar who said like this, Rabbi Kiva has an opinion that if a person sells a field, let's say you sell a field, and in the field you have a swimming pool, right? So then Rabbi Kiva sells, if you don't have anything written out in the document, basically you sold the land besides the swimming pool, you actually sold the entire land, and you gave a right to the purchase of the land to plant up until your swimming pool. And if you want to get to the swimming pool, you're going to have to rebuy some property back from the person that bought your property. Because moicher, when a person sells, ba'ayin yafa moicher, he sells with a good eye. He sells everything. He sells everything and doesn't keep anything for himself. So therefore, one would think that if a person sold the land and kept the trees for himself, he actually sold the land underneath the tree. So we say not so. Even Rabbi Kiva would agree that when normally you would say that a person sells even the land underneath the tree, but not so, because by a swimming pool, let's say, when you sold a property with a swimming pool, you sold the entire land all around the swimming pool, because swimming pool doesn't hurt the land around it. So therefore, when you sold it, you actually sold all the real land besides the area of the swimming pool. Therefore, when you want a way to get to your swimming pool, you have to rebuy back a path to get to the swimming pool from the person that bought it for you. But let's say you own land and the trees, and you sold the land to somebody. We go to Amud Beis, Lamed Zayin Amud Beis. The kamakashi ba'ara, when obviously trees need the land. Trees need to grow from the ground, and it causes all the area around it to become weakened. So you never sold that area around the tree, shiuri she'aya, because you left something for yourself. The Eloi shiuri she'aya, if you didn't leave any of the land for the tree, lay malay, what's going to happen is that the person that bought your property, he's going to say, akor ilana vizil. As soon as your tree dies, he's going to say to the original owner of the land, get out. Your tree died, and now you can't replant there. And nobody would want that to be. Now, what happens in the reverse case? Mochar ilanas v'shir karka lefonav. In the reverse case, he actually sold the trees and he kept the land. And one owner, he owned trees and land, and he sold the trees and he left the land. So what did he sell when he sold it to a stranger, the tree? There is a machlekes Rabbi Kiva and Rabbanan. Kluk to Rabbi Kiva Rabbanan, you have a machlekes Rabbi Kiva Rabbanan. Rabbi Kiva, the Amma Moicha ba'ayin yafa moicha, when a seller always sells, he sells the nicest way. He sells the nicest way. So he probably sold the land underneath the tree. So Islay. So that's when you sold the tree, you sold the land underneath the tree. The Rabbanan, according to Rabbanan, Leslay. According to Rabbanan, a person doesn't sell the land underneath the tree. You always sell in the cheapest way possible. And therefore, you didn't give the right to the person that bought the trees, the land underneath, so that if his tree died, he can replant there. So the Gemara explains and elaborates just another line. Rabbi Kiva Islay. According to Rabbi Kiva, a person sells with an ayin yafa. He sells with a good eye. He sells the land underneath the tree. Now, as I explained before, but Rab Zvid said a person doesn't sell the land underneath the tree. So why is Rab Zvid different than Rabbi Akiva? The answer is, Rav Zvid's case is, remember, when we started discussing this topic, it was one guy who owned the land and trees, sold the trees to one person, and he sold the land to the other person. That's very different than if you own the land and the trees and you're selling just one thing, you're selling the trees. So when you're one person selling the trees, you sold it in a nice way, and therefore you sold the land underneath. But if you have two people buying from one person, so Rabbi Zid will say that Rabbi Kiva would hold, in our case, that the person that bought the trees did not buy the land underneath, because the person that's selling, he sold the seller sold the entire land totally to the one person that bought the land, and he sold only the trees to the person that bought the trees. So that's what he says. When was it said? When the Rav Zid said you don't own the land underneath the tree, so you have two purchases off one person. One guy buying the karka and one guy buying the tree. Because the owner of the land will say, just like I don't own anything of the trees, I only bought the land. So you bought the trees, you don't own any of the land. Over here, it's the guy, it's one person selling off from his property just the trees. He sold it with a nice eye. He allows the person, he gave the person in the property that not just you're buying the trees, but you own the property underneath the tree. And so that if the tree that I sold you dies, you can replant there. The Rabbanan less like Rabbanan, that the person that bought the trees cannot replant there. Even according to Rapapa who says yesh loy, even according to Rapapa who says that when your person buys the trees, he also owns the land underneath the tree. But Rapapa's case again is the same place where he argued against Rav Zid. Because when there's two purchasers buying from one person, so the person that bought the trees actually owns part of the property, because the owner of the tree says, just like he sold you the land with a good eye, so the seller also sold me the trees with a good eye. In other words, he actually sold it to me with the property underneath, because we have one guy getting rid of everything. He's getting rid of his land and he's getting rid of his trees. So if he's getting rid of his land and getting rid of his trees, he sold each one of them in a nice way. But one person selling off his trees, if he's one person selling off his trees, he sells it in the most cheapest way possible, in the bad eye. In other words, when a person has to sell the trees because he needs the money, he's probably only selling the tree and not the land underneath. And therefore, according to Rabbanan, if the tree would die, you would not have a right to replant a new tree. One more piece of the Gemara, and then we'll stop. Amrei neher doi. In the Erdoi, it was said, Acholan ritzufen ein loy chazaka. If you planted a bunch of trees, let's say so many crowded trees in a small area, so ein loy chazaka, it's impossible to do a chazaka. Why? Because most of those trees are going to die, or you're going to cut them down anyway. So that can't establish a chazaka, because you're not using a field the way it's normally to use. There's certain rules of how to plant in a certain area, and if you have trees, if you planted a lot of trees in one area, and so it's like a nursery, and therefore you can't make a chazaka there, because you're eventually going to uproot everything. And once I know that you're going to uproot something, you can't establish a chazaka. So because the trees are not going to be there forever. This animal fodder, which grows every 30 days, right? And then you uproot it and then you replant it again. So there are certain plants that you're constantly uprooting and replanting. So also these trees, although they're condensed, very crushed together now, in a small area, and you're going to eventually uproot these trees, but you're going to plant new trees. So why can't I establish a chazaka just like by animal food? I can establish a chazaka. Elam Rava said, Machra Ritzufim Ein Karka. What we meant is you could establish a chazaka, that it's yours. But what we meant to say is that if a person buys a land and he buys trees, right? So then he doesn't own the karka around it. He doesn't own the land around it, only what's underneath the tree, but not the entire land, because eventually you basically, when you're buying an area that has so many trees, you're just buying the trees and not the entire perimeter property around that condensed area, because you're eventually going to uproot these trees. So we're not going to call this right now a orchard, a Sadei Elon. Rab Zeir says Kitanoy, it's like the following Tanoim. And Rava aligns himself up with Rab Shimon. What happens? We learned it in Mishnayos and Klayim. Kerem Shunutu al Pochas me'arba ava. You have vines, grapevines that are lined up, and there's no 4 amas in between one row of grapevines to the next row of grapevines. So eventually they can't grow that way. So do we consider it a grapevine area? What's the difference if it's a grapevine area? Can I plant a vegetable right near it within 3 tvachim? There's certain halachas that you have to know, is it called a kerem or not called a kerem? If it's not called a kerem, I'm allowed to plant the vegetable a little bit beyond 3 tvachim away from this area. Why is it not called a kerem? Because you're eventually going to uproot it. So Rab Shimon says, ain't a kerem. This entire area is not considered to be a vineyard. Chachamim says, it is considered a vineyard. We view the middle row, since you're going to uproot that, as if they're not there. So basically, you view whatever you're going to uproot as if imagine it's not there. And if you imagine that it's not there, then this is like a normal grapevine. And if it's a normal grapevine, the halachas of kerem do apply to it when it comes to the isurim of kalayim. So Rava, who says that machrim ritzufim ein loy karka, aligns himself up with Rab Shimon, because Rab Shimon holds that right now it's not a kerem because you didn't uproot it yet. So it's not a kerem. So therefore, machrim ritzufim ein loy karka, since right now it's not a Sdei Ilan, you don't own any of the land surrounding this Sdei Ilan. Okay, we'll stop over here, Be'ez Hashem.